So what we're seeing is a large group of blackbirds, so mostly grackles and probably red-winged blackbirds. Typically, these species will overwinter in the southern Midwest or even southern United States. And so there's a lot of birds in the area right now that are kind of overwintering. As part of their overwintering um, lifestyle is that they'll often roost together in large flocks. So oftentimes towards evening, we see large groups of blackbirds all kind of get together and they'll head to a kind of a communal roost within a particular area. Sometimes these roosts only have 100 birds in them. Sometimes they could be potentially up to over 1 million. So you'll see a large stream of these birds all come together to try and roost there. The large roosts are typically used during the wintertime because they're a good way to avoid predators, a good way for birds to kind of exchange information and different things as they kind of forage across the landscape, create bonds with other birds. So they'll roost there for the evening, overnight. And then the next morning they'll go out and they'll kind of spread out across the landscape again into smaller groups typically, and they'll go out and forage and do all the different things that birds do before coming back to roost again at night. Sometimes those roosts are used just for a couple of days. Sometimes it's kind of something that's used the entire winter. It just kind of depends. And both those species of blackbirds, the grackle and the red-winged blackbird, are very common birds. There's hundreds of millions of those birds potentially out there in the world. And so a lot of those birds that are spread out across North America during the breeding season are again kind of coming to this kind of condensed area during the winter time. So a lot of birds in a kind of a smaller space. When we think about how kind of a bird's yearly cycle, we have areas where they go out and they might breed. So they kind of go out into other portions of the country, other habitats, and that's where they'll breed. So they typically split up into smaller groups, typically a breeding pair, although sometimes it's a little variation within there. And then that accounts for 3 to 4 months out of the year where they're breeding, caring for youngsters, raising those youngsters, maybe breeding again and doing that process over and over. The rest of the year, they're just kind of worried about survival. So when we're talking about overwintering, they are not necessarily worried about breeding at that point. They're just worried about going from one day to the next day and hopefully getting to that next breeding year. So it's just how they're spending their downtime when they're not doing their breeding.